Dan is the Assistant Executive Director for the New Jersey Council on Compulsive Gambling. He graduated from the College of New Jersey with a BS in Finance and concentration in Economics. He holds his MS in Psychology from California Coast University. He's spoken at a dozen events around the country about internet and mobile device gambling, as well as emerging trends in sports gambling. Whether speaking on prevention strategies, treatment resources, responsible gaming, or recovery resources, Dan discusses the concept of gambling, addiction switching, co-occurrence, and behaviors associated with this devastating addiction. And I love listening and learning from Dan. I think he's been on with Illinois maybe once or twice, and we've got him coming on 2 more times. So, hey, Dan, we're excited to hear what you have to say today. And without further ado, you take it.
Wow, thanks, Robbie. That's a lot of information in a short amount of time. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you for being a great moderator and host. I'm going to put on my video for a moment because I always like to see and have people. Hello, Illinois. I cannot see you, but you can see me. So I'll be presenting for the next 45 or 50 minutes. I'm going to be turning my video off because I've had some intermittent issues with Wi-Fi, and by keeping the video off, it improves the bandwidth. So I hope you all enjoy what I have to say today. A lot of topic, a lot of material to cover. And if we have questions, if we have time, we'll go through the chat. Otherwise, we can certainly connect afterwards. A couple of points just to follow up on. Dr. Rugel is an amazing presenter. She's an amazing person in general. I would really encourage you to participate in her webinar on May 8th. As a matter of fact, she actually has put out some great work around the criminal justice population as well. And in addition to what you're going to hear today, I would encourage you to look up on YouTube a video that she put out along with the help from others at the University of Maryland on the problem gambling spectrum for gambling, opioids, in prison. So gambling, opiates in prison, and if you did a quick keyword search on YouTube using Dr. Rugel's name and gambling, opiates in prison, you'll find a wonderful video that's actually been very helpful in helping people understand the connection and also the impact that gambling can have on those people in certain communities and also among the prison population. Also, Robbie, it was good to hear you say the word finance, because that's how I've always said it, and I don't meet too many people that say finance. They always say finance. So I think that's why we get along so well. So today we're going to talk about, in a limited amount of time, we have less than an hour to talk about the criminal justice / forensic population. And it's important to consider at-risk groups. You know, the National Council on Problem Gambling has actually identified for this particular year criminal justice population as one of the 3 areas that they're focusing on, as well as different cultures and also the older adult community. So what makes a group at risk? Why is this something we need to consider? We're going to go through that today. I do have over 50 slides, and over 50 slides for less than a 1-hour workshop is a lot of material to have. These slides are available. I'm happy to send them to whomever might be looking for more information or to refer back. Not a problem. I'm pretty laid back. I'm happy to send that information to you. Just email me or email Robbie. He can get that stuff over to you. And that way it might generate some further conversation or discussion. One of the great things about doing webinars is that we get to meet people from different parts of the country who have different needs and different interests. And it's great to have some dialogue. After the one I did 2 weeks ago, I had some great dialogue, both on the phone as well as via email with some of the participants about college-age gambling and the concerns on the campuses. So that was really helpful. So let's get started with today. We're going to take a look, as I mentioned, just a background overview of gambling. For some of you, the concept of disordered gambling or problem gambling as an addiction might be new, or it might be something you're not really focusing on as much as, say, the substance use world. But Illinois is making some tremendous strides in the areas of gambling. We know gambling is coming, sports gambling is coming, if it has not already arrived. We know that fantasy sports is a hot button topic in the state of Illinois. We also know that casino gambling is something that's expanding. And if you start adding in internet-based gambling, like New Jersey has had since 2013, now you're really expanding the scope of where gambling can take place around the state. It's important that treatment providers are available for the individual or the family member who struggles with a gambling disorder. So as we talk about today, we talk about vulnerable populations. But first, what makes a group vulnerable? Why is the criminal justice population considered a vulnerable group? Well, It can be for many reasons. As you see here, we have lack of history, lack of access, maybe a history of being criminally justice involved. For some groups, there's an element of cognitive decline. Now, for older adults, that can occur organically over time as you age. But for other individuals who perhaps have been misusing substances for a number of years, and brain cells start to get depleted and they do not replenish, there can be that element of cognitive decline. Also experience. What about the adverse childhood experiences, right? ACEs. That's something that always needs to be weighed when an individual is struggling with any type of addiction or disease. The concept of unresolved trauma, a trauma that lives in the body. And there are times where a certain smell, a certain sound will bring out a behavior or elicit some type of response because the person feels as if they're reliving that experience. We find this obviously with PTSD. I'm sure Dr. Rugal will be talking about that with the military and the veteran population. But more personally, I can relate to the trauma piece, having worked in New York City back on September 11th, 2001, and having gone through that experience. That is something that stays with me to this day. So trauma lives in the body, but it has no voice. And there are times that it'll just kind of come out when you least expect it. So as we talk about types of gamblers, let's level set ourselves here. We want to first understand that over 90% of people, the estimate's around 90, it might even be as high as 92, roughly 90% of people are social gamblers. For those who gamble, it's an enjoyable experience, it's a form of entertainment, it does not create problems in their life, they have limits, they only gamble for short periods of time, and they do something else. They're not preoccupied, it's not creating relationship issues, financial issues, job issues, employment issues, etc. No interference with other parts of one's life. Problem gamblers, now we're starting to see along a continuum. If you think of it as a continuum, you're starting to see people who are starting to gamble longer than planned, maybe losing a little bit more than intended. Perhaps they're taking a trip or two to the ATM. Not really creating tremendous distress among the relationship or the family, but the problems start to occur. Perhaps this individual is starting to show signs of chasing their losses, meaning they're returning back to try to win back what they lost. And they're starting to become a little bit more preoccupied, and we start seeing the lying start to occur. Lying about how much time, how much money, lying perhaps about where the individual might be going. You know, lying is one of the areas, no matter what the addiction is, when someone starts to lie about what they're doing, that's a big indicator right there. As a matter of fact, we'll get into a little bit later on, there are some screening.
Dan? Hold on, folks. If you can hear me, we might be having a little bit of technical difficulty. Hang in there, and
Okay.
it might. There we go. Hey, Dan.
Yeah, I'm here still.
Okay. No, it might have been my connection. I just I lost you. So.
Okay.
There you go.
We're good?
Yeah, we're
Okay.
good. All right.
So we have disordered gamblers. We have disordered gamblers. 2 to 3% of disordered gamblers cannot pay household expenses or debts. That's where we start running into the issue of gambling for larger amounts, bailouts, gambling alone, isolation, alienation, and also for some, they start committing illegal acts to finance their gambling. So as we go through today, and we talk about signs of a gambling problem, oftentimes the financial signs are the first ones that will appear. And gambling is one of those addictions that you don't put it in your body. It's not a substance that you're putting in your body. Gambling is more of a behavioral. That's why for DSM-5, it's identified as the only non-substance related addictive disorder. It's a behavioral disorder. And so you don't put you don't put dice in your body. If you're giving a urine sample, you're not producing a positive urine screen for gambling, right? So we only can identify oftentimes through the behaviors and unfortunately, through some of the consequences. And one of the big ones is the financial signs. And so some of the signs of a gambling problem, as you can see on your screen here, the financial signs, okay? Hiding, lying, secretive about money. You know, a gambler will have two pockets on of money. One pocket is for gambling. The other pocket is for everyday household expenses. And oftentimes the gambling pocket is never empty. But if the spouse is asking perhaps their gambling spouse to pay a bill, well, the gambling spouse might say, I have no money for that. You have to pay it. Yet there's plenty of money to gamble with. And that's where you start running into the secrecy and some of the issues about the finances. Other signs of a gambling problem, behavioral signs. A person starts to frequently think and becomes preoccupied with the gambling. When will I gamble next? How will I do it? What will I gamble on? And then they're talking about it. If you start to notice it more in everyday conversation, we see this a lot with sports betting as well. It's funny when you watch TV now without sports betting, it's fascinating. There's no odds. There's no talk about what to bet on. There's no ticker on the bottom of the screen about what the line is on say a basketball game or in a baseball game. But oftentimes people will talk about those types of things. Other sign behaviorally is that an individual will stop doing things that he or she previously enjoyed because you start getting laser focused on this one activity. I had a good friend one time. The father would never come see his grandchildren or his son and daughter for Father's Day because the casino, the Borgata Casino in Atlantic City, gave the best comps that day. So the father could not get away from the casino. He just had to go to the casino for the comps. He put the casino ahead of time with family, missing family events. Other behavioral signs, when we talked a couple weeks ago for college students, declining grades, missing classes, decreased work performance. We've had people that show more signs of isolation. After losing, it's interesting, a gambler will start to worry if others will find out or where to get the money from. So they're not thinking about that going into the gambling. They're thinking about that when they're done. You see, gambling is one of the, and Dr. Rugel might comment on this, gambling is the one thing that can change someone's life. It is the one thing that can take you out of poverty. It can take you out of having nothing. It can take you from not mattering to others, in your own opinion, to mattering greatly because of this financial windfall. The problem is, gambling problems have nothing to do about money. Because the definition of gambling is risking something of value to win something of value, where the uncertainty, where there's risk or uncertainty, and the outcome is unknown. And oftentimes, money is used in gambling. But as we'll see in a little bit, within the prison culture and within the criminal justice population, there's no money in prison. You can't use money. That's not the concept. So people will use things of value that exist within the economy in which they live. Other signs of a gambling problem, emotional signs with withdrawal, right? Complaining of boredom and restlessness. That's also a big indicator of someone who's an internet gambler. Internet gambling is a unique and tricky type of gambling because the speed and the repetition of the internet gambling is so fast compared to that of a brick and mortar establishment that you can actually, studies have started to find that problems can develop quicker for the internet gambler, and the internet gambler is also found to gamble on many things, either simultaneously or for longer periods of time than the brick and mortar table gambler. Because you're reinforcing the neural pathway so quickly and you're getting so accustomed to making quick decisions, you start getting high on the rush and you start getting high on the speed and the action, which produces that dopamine. So there's a lot of studying right now on the impact of internet gambling versus brick and mortar traditional types of gambling. As we go through other signs of gambling problems, relationship signs, this is where we have isolation, withdrawal, person seems edgy. Now, there's similarities, right? We talk about gambling as being a non-substance related disorder, but as you can see from the previous slides, the similarities between gambling, drugs, and alcohol are several. We see they all have preoccupation, they all have withdrawal. Now, withdrawal from drugs and alcohol looks different than withdrawal from gambling. You cannot die from a gambling withdrawal, as we know. Some people have said they feel like they will die, but chemically, you will not die from improper withdrawal from gambling. We know that for drugs and alcohol, it's a different situation. Both show signs of progression. Both have increasing tolerance. We know that one can serve as a trigger for the other. Studies have shown that over 60% of problem and disordered gamblers also have a nicotine dependency and or an alcohol use disorder. So we start looking at connected behaviors. drinking while gambling, smoking while gambling, drinking and smoking while gambling. These are connected behaviors. And therefore, substitution of addiction is a concern as well. Because if a person is in recovery from alcohol use disorder, or they try to stop smoking, sometimes they'll switch over to gambling or vice versa. Substitution's a big issue. One of the workshops I'll be doing coming up in June, I believe for North Carolina, is the concept of addiction as a dis-ease. So what is not at ease within the person who is struggling with addiction? Because when you look at addiction, that's the outward manifestation of a deeper underlying issue. And trying to get to the core of the issue, one of the pastors for the church I attend always had a saying, without a good root, you can't produce good fruit. And so when we think about the nature of addiction and the dis-ease, what is going on at that deeper level, it's important over time to explore that. Other similarities between gambling, drugs, and alcohol, as you can see here, the lying, the denial, high return to use potential, etc. So Robbie, I'm going to turn it over to you now for polling question number 1 that you have on your end.
All right, I can't even unmute myself. Here we go. Okay, poll question number 1. Signs of a gambling problem include what? Is it A, emotional, B, behavioral, C, financial, D, relational, or E, is it all the above? Signs of a problem of a gambling problem include A, emotional, B, behavioral, C, financial, D, relational, or is it D, all the above?
Wow, good. Good.
Yeah, we're shooting through it, right?
Yeah, I like that.
I like the scoreboard so far, Dan. We're at 100%.
Yeah, so do I. I like the poll. I like to, listen, I try not to trick or use, reverse logic language or any of that stuff. I try to be very straightforward. We're not trying to fool anyone.
Well, I think the participants value that. The last one I gave last week, I did. and full transparency. Okay, there it is. They have it all right here. It's E, all the above.
At one point in my life, I was considering being an adjunct professor for a local university, and I thought to myself, the questions I would ask, I think everyone would get A's because I think I'd be too soft.
You're all right. You're all right.
That's great, Robbie.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Now, let's see, do I take that off my screen here? Let me see. Okay, perfect.
You good?
Yes, I am.
All right.
So as we start going through, and way to go, everyone. I'm glad everyone, it's a pretty straightforward question, loosening up the brain as we're moving through today. Let's take a look at an interesting model. Now, this is one that I've been following a little bit. This is called the sequential intercept model for criminal justice. This is a conceptual type model. And the focus here is the interaction between the community and law enforcement for those with mental illness entering the criminal realm. So we know that people who are criminally justice involved at times will also have co-occurring mental health issues and or suffer from a substance use disorder or a gambling disorder. There could be multiple things going on. So the model that was produced depicts a series of points at which interventions can be made to help prevent people or try to prevent people from falling deeper within the criminal justice system, to help reduce recidivism, and to get them help at an earlier point instead of going further and further. And one of the beauties of this model was that it speaks to the diversion and the alternatives for dealing with criminalization. When I talk about diversion, last Friday, New Jersey Council, in partnership and in connection with the Nevada Council, hosted Judge Cheryl Moss. She runs the only gambling court in the nation within Nevada. And that's a diversionary court. So similar to those areas that host a drug court, New Jersey has drug court, many states have the drug court model, where you're trying to take low-level offenders, put them on a diversionary program, and give them a track to return to the community without keeping them warehoused in prison. This is the similar concept, only for gambling. And it's the only one in the country. And we had a wonderful webinar, wonderful discussion about the alternatives to incarceration for those people who can make restitution, be gainfully employed, return and do community service. So the alternatives, these are healthy alternatives to dealing with criminalization. And so the sequential intercept model is based also on an updated model was based on the 2017 CARES Act And the goal here was to provide more support and collaboration between criminal justice and the healthcare providers. And so if you look at this model from Intercept Zero, which is your community-based services, these are the crisis helplines, crisis care, first responders to a situation. And as we move left to right along this continuum, we see the 911, the local law enforcement, the boots on the ground, the everyday enforcement of day-to-day. These are natural, organically occurring intercept points for dealing with those folks who might be towing the line, who might be might have low-level crimes, or as we go through Intercept 2, now they've been caught, accused, convicted. As you move through 2 and 3, you have detention, you have court appearances. Again, the judge in that first court appearance, perhaps at times is setting bail, perhaps at times, we know bail reform in New Jersey has been a big topic because the prisons were getting overcrowded. So these are a lot of intercept points that naturally occur along the process. And then we start getting into jails, prisons, specialty courts, as we talked about. Maybe it's a DUI, right? So drug court, we have DUI, we have the Intoxicated Drivers Resource Center, which is an offshoot for those who have been convicted of driving while under the influence or have a certain number of points on their license. You have to take mandatory classes on weekends to start earning your license back. And then we have Intercept 4 and 5, which is your reentry, your community corrections. So that's your prison, parole, probation. So if you've never seen this model before, it shows you and kind of opens up the eyes to say there are many different points before a person gets to prison that we can touch an individual. And every one of those touches can matter into that person's healthy and safe and effective return to society. So let's take a look at the criminal justice population. Number one, we have to talk about crime and stress. So someone who's convicted of crime, there's a weight on their shoulder. And that weight stems from the fact that they've just been found and caught for something that they were doing potentially illegally or actually illegally. And while some have indicated there's a weight that's been lifted off the shoulder, the weight of the lying, the weight of the deceit, the weight of the illegal activity, that weight is now replaced with the harsh reality that they likely will have to serve some time for what they've done. So there is a high element of crime and stress. And then within that, sometimes people will turn to gambling. They'll look at gambling to alleviate financial pressures. Those who have committed crimes worry about the stress on the impact on the family. They've lost a job, and they also think about, how will I find a new job? How will I support my family? I have to find a way to get money. And through all of these bullet points here, you can identify and easily see why that might produce anxiety or depression, or a cognitive distortion that gambling might be the only way out. It's the only thing that will take me out of this terrible situation that I've put myself in and try to still provide for my family. That's one of the areas that we're concerned about. Within the criminal justice population, there are various crime types among gamblers in treatment programs. So when you've had a gambler who's committed a crime and is now in either treatment or in prison, some of the common crime types for a gambler include forgery or fraud, white-collar crimes like tax violation or tax evasion, running an illegal gambling operation. Less common typically are the armed robbery, the violent crimes, the drug sales, domestic violence, domestic assault. Typically, for someone who has been convicted of a crime and are in treatment right now and who was a gambler, you'll find the first three, the white-collar type of crimes. And those are not victimless crimes. Just because there's not a physical violence perpetrated, those are still victims. Those victims have had their money stolen, but that's not all. They've had their trust stolen. They've had their peace of mind stolen, their safety and security, which at a deeper human level will always outweigh the amount of money that a person has. When someone does not have the ability to trust or feel safe and secure any longer, that's a type of trauma, and that trauma lives with the person. And how that individual then is made whole, the restitution, the money will be paid back to the individual, but what about some counseling? What about some grief counseling from the loss that someone may have had? What about the trauma that that person has now endured? throughout this entire situation. It's more than just restitution of money. The victims oftentimes should be receiving other types of support services, including counseling. So in prison, let's now talk about what happens in prison. For any of you that work with those in prisons or know of someone who's been in prison, gambling and gambling paraphernalia among correctional officers are seen only as a moderate concern. It's something that keeps people busy. It's not creating an immediate harm. No one's really getting angry or assaulting over it. Now, some people do get angry if they're not getting paid, obviously. But it's a moderate concern. It keeps the peace, if you will. It's almost as if gambling is the other correction officer that's in the room keeping everyone at bay. So the correction staff sees gambling as relatively harmless. Only time it's not harmless is when an issue arises. Now, many prisons do have prohibition as a deterrent, but gambling would be hard to enforce. So you tell in prison you can't drink, right? No alcoholic beverages, no cell phones, no weapons. There's prohibition. You can't have these things. But gambling, you'd have to eliminate cards, television, dice, games, newspaper. You'd have to eliminate everything. And then what's going to happen, you'll probably result in some more unruly behavior. So it's a bit of a give and take. Gambling also allows people to pass time, relieve boredom. It's a way of socializing. And it also adds some excitement to an otherwise mundane day of waking up, doing a job, or staying within a cell, or going into the yard. So it's just one more activity for someone to do, okay? Now, gambling, we talked about, there's no money per se in prison. However, there are commissary items. Gamble for cigarettes, gamble for crackers, peanut butter, gamble for personal favors. We won't go too much into that. Could be push-ups, so, your mind can wander there. Gamble for extra supplies like pens and papers. And also, there's prison bookies. So, very simply done, the individual who gets the newspaper every day sees the lines, the odds. Give it during football season, for example. Person just writes down on a piece of paper what they want to, who they want to bet on. They risk a stack of peanut butter or a pack of tuna fish, and now all of a sudden they have something of value that's been risked, and they're trying to win something of value. But what's interesting is that some people go to prison, they don't ever have a gambling problem, but while they're in jail or prison, because it's part of the culture, they might come out with a gambling problem. So gambling in the prison culture, what we typically find, and this was a study done by Dr. Robert Williams. Dr. Williams is a wonderful individual. He collaborated with Dr. Wood in Canada, and they developed the only evidence-based program named Stack Deck. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that. Stack Deck is the only evidence-based program shown to change attitudes among youth about gambling, and the youth aged 12 to 17. And it was developed in 2005. It's currently under review for update. There's a few things in the works with that, not really at liberty to go much further beyond the fact that they're reviewing to update it to bring it more current. But in this particular example, Dr. Williams reviewed 30 studies worldwide and found that up to 1/3 of the prisoner population met the criteria for problem gambling. 1/3. And so that shows you that, generally speaking, the rates of gambling among inmates tends to be higher than that of the general population. I don't get too lost in actual numbers. I like to draw conclusions and the tendencies, and I think it makes sense if we think that when you're in a confined space with limited alternatives or limited forms of entertainment, to me, intuitively, it makes sense that gambling could be one of those things that someone would do. This passed the sniff test. This makes sense to me. And gambling primarily includes cards and sports betting, okay? Gambling in the prison culture. So why do we have high rates of gambling? So if we think about gambling as the outward manifestation of something else that's going on at the deeper level, think about people in prison, what they're struggling with or dealing with. They struggle with managing behaviors. They may not have good coping skills. They struggle to find who they are. What is their identity? Especially when you go to a new place like prison, you have to quickly identify who are you going to be? You're going to be tough? You're going to be calm? You're going to be laid back? What is your role going to be within that new civilization, if you will? That's a whole separate world. And people who gamble, they want to feel a sense of acceptance. That's biggest among those who commit sex crimes. Sex offenders find the most acceptance sitting at a gambling table. Otherwise, they're segregated off to the side oftentimes because of the nature of the crime. There's a hierarchy in prison, and sex offenders and crimes against children rank at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that's why there's a fear oftentimes for their safety and their well-being. So they're oftentimes separated from the general population. Gambling in prison culture, oftentimes people want a quick fix solution. They want to escape. They want to alleviate boredom. They want to relieve stress. And they just want to socialize. They don't want to be isolated. The societal and family costs on gambling in prison. This is where you start running into a bit more of a concern. While an individual is incarcerated, they don't have the ability to earn a meaningful income. They might have a job that provides them a basic nominal pay, which can buy some items on a prison economy, but you don't have money to send back to your family or loved ones. And oftentimes that's why you see the cycle of recidivism, is that someone will get out and they only learned one way to live life. They only know that they want to earn fast money. The problem is fast money spends fast. And oftentimes you start chasing that lifestyle. You start chasing the fast money, and that leads to recidivism. We have to break the cycle. We have to help people break the cycle. In the previous slide, I'm going to go back to bullet point number 2. Oftentimes individuals do not have good coping skills. See, this is where we can intersect, and this is where we can make a difference. Within the prison culture, within education, giving people the tools so that when they come out of prison, instead of just medicating someone, giving them life skills, giving them coping skills, showing them how to deal with anger, anger management, anger resolution, decision making. Oftentimes, people who go to prison, they may not have these, or they have them to a lesser extent, right? Each person's an individual, and it all starts with treating the person as an individual. Studies of gamblers in prison. There was a study done, and I believe this one was in Australia. Australian prisoners, problem and disordered gambling was associated with social anxiety, depression, substance abuse or substance use disorder, impulsiveness, and also current and childhood ADHD symptoms. So what are some of the barriers faced by prison cultures? We talked about the problems. We talked about lack of coping skills, lack of life skills. But there's also barriers. And one of them, oftentimes, is the lack of awareness on how gambling can really be bad. People don't think gambling can be really harmful. If you've never experienced it personally or know of someone who has maybe struggled with a gambling problem, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that someone should just stop gambling. It's easy to think of someone who gambles as being greedy or money hungry. Just stop. You're not putting anything in your body. Why can't you just control yourself? And those are all the false assumptions we make. And DSM, when they elevated gambling as the only non-substance related addictive disorder, that helped. That helped kind of put a diagnostic code, number 1, to something that has long been thought to be just a moral weakness, because it's not. Same areas of the brain light up between a cocaine addict and a gambling addict. You don't have to put a drug in your body to become addicted to it, okay? So when we look at the barriers, we have lack of awareness. We talked before about the lack of leisure activities, okay? We talked about gambling for some people, when it becomes bad, can be an isolating activity. And if you have an isolating activity and you've been in prison and now you're returning to society, coming out of prison, it's hard to reconnect and build social support systems. That's a natural barrier. People find out that you've been in prison, they might look at you differently, they may not invite you to the house, they might have a preconceived notion about you. So that's really important. And the last one, as I note there, is the lack of resiliency, life skills, or coping mechanisms. We talk about reentry. I just mentioned getting back into society. You know, you've just destroyed trust. When you've committed a crime, or you've stolen, or you've done something to hurt or harm another individual, you've stolen trust. And for some people who have a gambling problem, that trust is a big issue, because they're not trusted with money, they're not trusted with their words, with where they're going. Same for substance use disorder. But also reentry for prison, some of the barriers and reentry issues, difficulty obtaining work. Companies, if they find out that you had a history of incarceration, you may not qualify for work. It's important that some laws are being circulated, even right now, about whether or not employers can ask that question. Have you ever been convicted, or have you been convicted in the last number of years? Certain crimes are expungible, certain crimes are not. So it really becomes tricky. Another reentry issue is sometimes there's no support services. Depending on where you are in your community or where your state, where you are in the town, you may have a rural area with very little in the way of 12-step support services. Maybe the networking is not solid. Perhaps oftentimes the parole or probation officer may not understand the nature of a gambling addiction. That's a concern. So we had an individual who was on a supervised release program in New Jersey, and his officer was not familiar with gambling as an addiction. It was brand new. But the officer did something that was amazing. This is a parole officer who took the time to learn about the nature of a gambling addiction. And he actually called our helpline and said, wow, I had no idea that gambling was a real addiction. So when we're screening people for gambling problems, there's 5 gambling screens oftentimes that come up. And here's the 5 right here. Very simple. The live bet 2-question test is the quickest, down and dirty way to find out if somebody may or should be screened in a more comprehensive manner. It's interesting when I look at the live bet questionnaire. Again, this is the quickest way to screen initially. And it asks 2 questions. Have you ever lied to the people important to you about how much money you gamble? And have you ever felt the need to bet more and more money? So this talks about lying and it talks about chasing, right? Lying and chasing are 2 indicators. If a person's answering yes to either one of these 2 questions, you will want to put them through a more rigorous screen. And that can include the DSM-5 screening criteria, right? It can include the South Oaks gambling screen, which I'll get to in a moment. But what's interesting here is if you look at the questions that we ask people, or any clinicians on this webinar today, we're asking people, have you ever lied? I always wonder, and there's no answer that I'm really looking for here, but if we were to reposition this question and say, have you always been truthful to the people important to you about how much you gamble? See, I always wonder, the way we ask a question, what type of response does it elicit? We're asking if someone has lied. Automatically, a person might go on the defensive. But if we ask the question very similarly, have you always been truthful? I wonder if that would generate a different response. I just throw that out there to kind of ponder the importance of the language we use when we ask questions. Because when I ask someone on a phone who calls into 800 Gambler, and I'll say, do you think you have a gambling problem? The individual oftentimes will say, well, I really don't gamble. I just play lottery 4 or 5 times a week. You see, they said they don't gamble. Well, they're just calling us because they think they have a gambling problem, but they don't look at it as gambling. They think they're playing lottery and they have a marriage problem. They have a money problem. They have a relationship issue. It's not a gambling problem, though. So it's interesting how people perceive the word gambling and some of the other language that they use instead. So just keep that in mind if you're screening someone. The word gambling may not even be the right word to use. I prefer to ask people, how much money have you spent in the past week on lottery tickets, sports betting, at the casino? Ask people how much money they have spent as opposed to gambling. Sometimes that generates a better reply. Moving forward here, the brief biosocial gambling screen is a 3-question test, 3-question screening exam. Again, you can see these. We'll send this to you via the PowerPoint via email. The South Oaks screen is a comprehensive screen. This is one I want to bring to your attention. This is based on DSM-3 criteria, though. It's based on information from the late 80s. So it's an old screen, but it's still used universally and internationally. It can be self-administered. It can be given by a clinician. It's about 4 pages long. And an individual, a screener will typically use this if one of the preliminary screens yielded a positive result. So if someone answered yes to one or both of the live bet tests, now you might move on to the South Oaks screen. The other screen you might move on to is the DSM-5 screen. That's the most current. That's from 2013, when gambling was elevated to the non-substance related addictive disorder. And DSM-5, that was big, because now, as I mentioned before, gambling is seen as an addictive disorder. It can be treated. It has a diagnostic code. And that's where we have to also identify, if you look at the last bullet point here, it's identified along a continuum. So if someone answers yes to 4 or 5 of the 9 questions, they're considered to have a mild gambling disorder. 6 or 7 is moderate. 8 or 9 is severe. So it even classifies and quantifies gambling along a continuum. I'll stop right here so Robbie can ask polling question 2 before we move through the rest of the day.
Cool. Okay, we'll go to the second polling question, which I believe is a true or false. And it asks, the 2-question live bet test is a quick way to screen for gambling problems. Mark A if it's true, B if it's false. The 2-question live bet test is a quick way to screen for gambling problems. Mark A if that's true, or B if it's false. So we are already nearing 90%.
Wow. Good, good, good.
Yes, it's looking good. We'll give it 10 or more seconds here. We're at 97%. So I'll give it 5 seconds here.
Very good.
Okay. Looks like 94% of the 97% that have answered got it. It's true.
There we go. Excellent. Good job. It is true. It is true. It is the quickest way to screen for a gambling problem. As we move through, thanks, Robbie, for doing that. As we move through here, so we've talked about gambling, the prison culture, the barriers, gambling that goes on in prison, some screening instruments. So now we want to just talk about a recovery culture. What does a recovery culture really look like? And this is not scientific. This is something that we just kind of think through. But if we're helping somebody with any type of addiction, it doesn't just have to be gambling. It could be any type of addiction. We want to reinstill laughter. We want to help a person kind of figure out who they are again. What's their identity? You know, one of the hardest things for a gambler is to give up that identity of being the gambler, being the gambling guy, the gambling girl, someone who's got the big flashy money to throw around. It feeds the ego. It makes them feel good. People like to be around someone who's happy and spending money and the life of the party, whatever you want to call it. But if a person's in recovery from those things, their old friends may not continue to be their friends. And that's what we oftentimes will see someone who's in recovery from addiction. The individual has to focus more. You can't focus on keeping the addiction out of your life. What I mean by that is if you lean up against a wall, if you were just put your hands against the wall and just lean there, let all your body rest on your hands and your wrists, and you're just holding yourself up against the wall, eventually your arms will get tired. So what you're trying to do there is you're trying to keep the addiction out of your life. Rather, we have to have people create a whole new life where the addiction no longer fits in. It's a difference. We can't keep the addiction out. We have to create a life where the addiction no longer fits in. That means new friends, new activities, new employment, right? New thoughts and behaviors, new hobbies, all of these areas where the addiction just doesn't have time to fit in my life anymore, but it has to be managed on a daily basis because you never conquer addiction. You can beat it on a daily basis. You can beat it minute by minute, but you're never cured of addiction because the addiction switch always stays on. Once it's on, it's on. Now you have to manage it and maintain it. So oftentimes we want to cultivate a recovery culture. As you see here, there's many different bullet points. I'm a big fan of incorporating life skills, teaching or refining life skills, coping skills, right? Teaching people how to respond instead of react. That 5 to 10 second difference becomes very important. The HALT principle. If someone's hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, oftentimes those can be triggers for return to use. Take care of those basic needs first. Having emotional awareness, putting others first. Going back to laughter, we find oftentimes people who struggle with addiction, they lose the ability to laugh or they lose joy in their life. So these are things that we want to make sure that we can help people with. Commonly cited strengths for recovery, group participation, that's important. Going to a meeting is great, but then actually taking ownership of your recovery journey is important. Participating, establishing meaningful relationships, having gainful and meaningful employment, and also making a commitment to change or transformation. You know, it's interesting when we think about, again, the concept of the word change versus transformation. I've always thought of change as just kind of changing my clothes. I come home from work, I change my clothes, I go for a run. I'm still the same person on the inside, I just changed my outward appearance. Transformation is a bit deeper. Transformation is taking the inside and turning it inside out almost. You're transforming from one to the next. So I think about the difference between the words change and transformation as being very important for the recovery culture. But there are also barriers to recovery, and people struggle with these. And we know this because social workers do a great job of addressing many, if not all of these. Oftentimes, case managers and social workers deal in this a lot. Housing issues, transportation issues, substance use. What's interesting is that the tobacco and the smoking is oftentimes one of the last things that people will give up. And that's a hard one to give up too, because you can give up your gambling, you give up your drugs, you give up whatever else you're doing, but I'm still going to smoke my cigarettes. If you go to a 12-step room, you'll find oftentimes sugary sweet treats, caffeine with coffee, and a lot of smoking. Those three things continue to occur. Could those be recipes for return to use? I don't know. Dr. John Grant, who lives in Illinois, wonderful doctor, speaks on gambling addiction regularly, a wonderful speaker. We've spoken a couple times together, same conferences, and he oftentimes will have a client of his say, hey doctor, do you think I can play video games if I have a gambling addiction? His answer is always the same. I don't know. Try it out. Let me know how you feel. And that's why it's an individual journey. It's an individual path that people choose along the recovery walk. Others cited barriers to recovery, addiction switching, criminal involvement, right? Recidivism is an area, but also boredom starts to set in. You know, many of us now during this coronavirus pandemic have perhaps been sitting around the house or have been majorly or minorly disrupted from everyday life. Boredom is something that can really happen. And you have people who start to say, I don't know what to do next. And you start going down these little paths in your mind about the what if scenarios. And you have to be careful not to go too far down that path. That's when you pick up the phone, you call, you get out of that isolation, and you look for social support. And you find those meaningful activities. One of the webinars that I was on in terms of dealing with COVID-19 is make a list. Write down the list of activities, a list of things that give you joy, things that you enjoy doing. So if you're ever in a path or in a negative headspace, you actually have something you can look at. You pin it on your refrigerator, you pin it on your wall, so you don't have to think about it. It's already there. It's already been thought of. You just have to read it. And then you just do one of those activities. And it can oftentimes help someone snap out of a negative space. The end goal of treatment is working toward a sustained and meaningful long-term recovery. This is from Dr. DuPont, the founding president of the Institute for Behavioral Health. I love this quote. And the reason I love the quote is for the two words that are underlined on the slide: sustained and meaningful. What's sustained and meaningful for me may not be for you. And so that's why it's important to always remember that each client is an individual. What's sustained and meaningful for them may not be for you. They bring different tools, they bring different life skills, different coping mechanisms to the table. We have to analyze what they're bringing to the table and then see what other tools are needed for their tool belt. As we think through treatment and recovery, always remember that the negative thoughts are what keep us trapped, but it's the positive intentions that can set us free. Awareness of an issue is not enough. Motivation to change is what's needed. And when you have awareness without equipping somebody with the life skills or the coping mechanisms, that won't work. I can know that I have an issue. I can know that I have a problem in my brain. Cognitively, I can know that I'm creating issues in my family, that the actions I'm taking right now will lead me to prison. I can know all of that. But if I don't believe in my heart that I need to do something about it, or if I don't feel as if I want to do something about it, or if I don't know how to even take the first step, I'm oftentimes not going to, because that fear of the unknown is so scary. We see that a lot with folks who are trapped in relationships that are toxic, in domestic violence situations. We see people who just don't know or are afraid of exiting something that's so familiar, even though it's so negative and it's so violent. The unknown is even scarier. That applies across the spectrum, even in treatment and recovery. So we want to help people develop an attitude of recovery. We want to instill humility and gratitude, help people find the respect for themselves and for others, focus on relationships instead of isolation, the love versus hate, especially being present. Being present is a huge attitude of a good, sustainable, long-term recovery. Sobriety, just a quick comment on sobriety. What is true sobriety? You know, are we dealing with the pain or are we escaping the pain, right? Are we properly attached? And then what are we attached to? Am I attached to a prior life? Am I attached to an individual that can become toxic, someone that can actually encourage me to return to use instead of maintain sobriety? And also recognize what forces are trying to disrupt these attachments, right? So it's very important to understand the difference between true sobriety and recovery. Oftentimes you'll hear people say, I'm not in recovery, I'm in abstinence. I've known people for 20, 30 years in recovery from various addictions. However, one can almost argue they're just abstaining, white knuckle, because they're still so angry and miserable on a daily basis. They haven't dealt with the true underlying issue. They're just one day at a time, white knuckling to not use or return to use. So we have our principles of a meaningful recovery. You can see here, this is from Samson 2012. This is a nice wheel. Should be person-driven, have many pathways, be holistic, include peer support and relations. It should be respectful of culture, addressing trauma, identifying an individual's strengths and responsibilities. And there's more details on the slides to come here as we go through this. I'm going to just quickly move through these, okay? We also have the concept of hope, perception, and imagination. This is from a great book called The Body Keeps the Score. I recommend this for those of you who are interested on the impact of trauma and the physiological impact in the body. So trauma lives in the body, as I mentioned at the beginning, but it also has a physiological impact. And one of the great lines from this book talks about hope, perception, and imagination, and how trauma steals the ability to perceive a new normal, to imagine a greater possibility. Without imagination, there is no hope, there's no chance to envision a better future, and there's no place to go or no goal to reach. That's what trauma can do to people. Trauma can create mental inflexibility, right? You lose your mental flexibility because the trauma continually pulls you in the past. We have to help people break those chains. Robbie, let's go to polling question 3 before we wrap up.
Sure. Okay, poll question number 3, I believe just covers what Dan just went over, which asks, which principle for meaningful recovery covers the mind, body, and spirit? Is it A, peer support? Is it B, holistic? Is it C, respect? Or is it D, cultural? Which principle for a meaningful recovery covers the mind, body, and spirit? Is it A, peer support? Is it B, holistic? Is it C, respect? Or is it D, cultural? And we're nearing 85%. We'll do T minus 10. Yep.
Yep.
4, 3, 2, 1. And it's B, holistic.
Very good, very good. 77%, and that will be a function of me trying to get through those last couple slides. Holistic does cover mind, body, and spirit, so well done. Those are all important elements: peer support, respect, cultural, but holistic, by its very nature, covers many different areas, including the mind, body, and spirit. So very well done for everyone on that. So as we think through the rest of today, I know we have about 1:58 on the clock here, a couple of summary points of recovery principles. Don't think less of yourself, just think of yourself less. That's one area that's really helped a number of people. When you take the focus off yourself and you're helping someone else out, it just automatically generates a dopamine boost. Helping someone else out makes you feel good knowing that you're helping another individual. There's a phrase that I love and I use it for every one of my workshops. And the phrase is, rules without relationships leads to rebellion. This is paramount. You know, if I just focus on the rules only and I don't take the time to develop a relationship with an individual, develop a relationship with maybe a program that I'm a part of, ultimately it will lead to rebellion. Real quick, if you have an 8-year-old at home and you ask them to clean up their room and they don't do it, and you yell at them, then they'll clean up because they want to comply and they're rule-based. They're going to follow the rules. What happens when that 8-year-old turns 18 and you yell at them to clean up the room? Well, you may not get the same compliance. It might come with a lot more pushback. But if you take the time to develop the relationship instead of just focus on the rules, that will lead to less rebellion. So rules of that relationship leads to lots of rebellion in many different areas. Just kind of element of life that I find to hold true on a regular basis. Elvin Semrad, a professor from Boston University, said the greatest sources of suffering are the lies we continue to tell ourselves. I love that one. We talked about Bessel van der Kolk and physiological response to stress and trauma. I want to make sure I threw that out there, as well as Seth Haynes, who's an author for a book. He struggled with alcohol addiction, and one of his lines was, "Pleasure is joy's assassin." So seeking a short-term pleasure steals from long-term joy. And that's something you find people who are struggling with addiction, is they're looking for that constant short-term pleasure to relieve a negative state, but it's sapping or stealing from long-term joy. And last, for people trapped in a mental prison of addiction, they battle between enjoying the pain of pleasure while suffering from the pleasure of the pain. I want to thank everyone for being on here today. And Robbie, I want to thank you as always. I hope it kind of stirred the brain, made you think, and I'm always happy to be a resource going forward. Thanks, Robbie.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And I love the last point that you made, Seth Haynes. The pleasure is joy's assassin. So thanks for that. So thank you, Dan. It was great stuff. Very good. And you're getting a bunch of thank yous go across now from your chat. So
Great.
Guys, we look forward to the next one, which will be on a week from today, same bat time, same bat channel, where Dan will be presenting on the wild world of sports. Everybody have a great day, and thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye-bye.